The last mission of Sergeant John R. He was just another soldier, until the truth came out. The morning sun cast long shadows across the military cemetery as Sarah Mitchell walked between the weathered headstones, her grandfather's journal clutched tightly in her hands. She had discovered it hidden in his attic just days after his funeral, wrapped in an old canvas bag that smelled of gunpowder and memories. What she found inside would change everything she thought she knew about Sergeant John R. Mitchell, the quiet man who had raised her after her parents died in a car accident. For 25 years, John had been the silent hero of a war that America was still trying to forget. There was so much to tell about him, but he never spoke of it. Not to others, not even to his family. His name was rarely mentioned in military circles, remembered only by his closest comrades, his brothers in arms, who had witnessed something extraordinary in the jungles of Vietnam. But one day, after completing his final mission, the world would reach him and his story in ways he never expected. Sarah opened the journal to the first entry, dated March 15, 1965. The handwriting was steady, precise, like the man himself. Shipping. Out to Vietnam tomorrow, it read. Mom cried at dinner. Dad just nodded and shook my hand. I wonder if I'll ever see home again. She had never known her grandfather as anything but the gentle man who taught her to fish, who helped with her homework, who never missed a single school play or soccer game. The idea that he had once been a young soldier, scared and uncertain, heading into one of America's most controversial conflicts, seemed impossible. Sergeant John Mitchell was an American soldier, drafted in 1965 and sent to Vietnam as part of the escalating military presence. His first assignment was a night raid designed to defend a retreating base deep in enemy territory. But that night, nothing went according to plan. John followed his commanding officer's orders and continued to advance when others might have fallen back. What he didn't know was that he was about to embark on a journey that would test his courage to its very limits and define him for the rest of his life. The journal entries painted a picture of a war that was nothing like the movies. Day 12 in country, John wrote. Lost 3 men yesterday to a booby trap. Tommy was only 19. He had a picture of his girlfriend that he showed everyone. Now it's covered in blood and dirt, and I can't stop thinking about how she never know what happened to him in those final moments. The weight of these words pressed down on Sarah as she continued reading, understanding for the first time the burden her grandfather had carried in silence for decades. As John stepped deeper into the Vietnamese jungle, the devastating nature of war was not foreign to him. But with each step, instead of being a man afraid of gunfire, explosions, and death, he emerged as a free and determined leader. No one realized that he was not just a soldier, but a legend in making. He moved silently, taking each step with confidence and purpose. He was simply a man doing what his duty required, but something more was building within him with each passing day. The jungle became his second home. A green hell where death lurked behind every tree and in every shadow. John learned to read the language of the forest, to distinguish between the call of a bird and the whistle of an incoming mortar round. His squad mates began to look to him for guidance, not because of his rank, but because of something ineffable about his presence. He had a way of staying calm under fire that inspired confidence in others. Mitchell knows something we don't, one soldier wrote to his wife. When he says move, we move. When he says wait, we wait. He's got this sixth sense about danger. But John's journal revealed the cost of this supernatural awareness. Can't sleep anymore, he wrote after 3 months in country. Every sound makes me reach for my rifle. Saw a kid today who couldn't have been more than 12, and for a split second I thought he might be carrying a grenade. What is this place doing to me? What am I becoming? The transformation from small-town American boy to hardened combat veteran was happening in real time, recorded in these pages that Sarah now held with trembling hands, the other soldiers in his unit began to tell stories about Sergeant Mitchell. How he had single-handedly held off a Viet Cong assault while his wounded comrades were evacuated. How he had navigated through enemy territory for 3 days with no map, bringing his entire squad home safely. How he seemed to know exactly when and where the enemy would strike next. These stories spread through the base camp like wildfire, growing more elaborate with each telling, but John never confirmed or denied any of them. He simply did his job and prepared for the next mission. John's final assignment was a raid on an abandoned base located deep in a forest in South Vietnam. The mission parameters were classified, but the journal entries from the days leading up to it revealed the gravity of the situation. Intelligence suggests the enemy is using the old firebase as a staging area for a major offensive, John wrote. Command wants us to neutralize it before they can launch their attack. 12 men going in. Statistical probability says not all of us are coming back. I've written letters to the families of every man in my squad, just in case. The team moved out under intense combat conditions and seemingly impossible circumstances. The enemy had fortified the abandoned base with machine gun nests, sniper positions, and a network of tunnels that made it nearly impregnable. The initial assault went wrong almost immediately. Mortar fire rained down on John's position, and within the first hour, half his squad was either dead or wounded. The radio operator was among the casualties, cutting off communication with headquarters. They were alone, outnumbered, and surrounded. Many soldiers died that day, but John's team survived against all odds. The mission was completed, but the silence within John never subsided, as everyone else filled the air with nervous laughter. And relief on the journey back to base, he continued forward without saying a word. No one thanked him because he had done what he did solely out of duty, but those who witnessed what happened in that jungle knew they had seen something extraordinary. Journal entries from that final mission were sparse, almost cryptic. Day 1, made contact with enemy at 0800 hours. Heavy resistance. Day 2, Wilson and Patterson didn't make it. Day 3, found another way. Day 4, it's over. But between these clinical notes, Sarah found something else tucked into the journal's binding, a letter that was never sent, addressed to her grandmother, written on the night before the final assault. My dearest Mary, the letter began, if you're reading this, then I didn't make it home. I need you to know that every day in this green hell, I thought about you and about the family we planned to build together. I thought about the little house with the white picket fence, about Sunday dinners and Christmas mornings, about growing old together on the front porch swing. These thoughts kept me going when nothing else could. But I also need you to know that I did what had to be done. Not just for my country, but for the future we dreamed of. The choices I made here will haunt me if I survive, but they were the only choices I could live with. Tell our children, if we're blessed to have them, that their father fought so they could live in a world where they wouldn't have to. When John returned to base after completing the mission, his comrades celebrated with stories and laughter. John R. never says anything because he's our silent hero, they would joke. But John didn't want to be remembered as just a soldier, and certainly not as a legend. There was something everyone accepted without question. John had helped bring an end to the fighting in their sector, but the war continued to rage within him. The nightmares, the hypervigilance, the way he flinched at sudden sounds, these were the invisible wounds that no metal could heal. The final entries in the journal revealed the struggle of coming home. Landed in San Francisco today, John wrote. Protesters at the airport called us baby killers. A girl who couldn't have been much older than my sister spit on my uniform. I understand their anger, but I wish they could understand that we were just kids too, doing what our country asked of us. How do I explain to Mary that the boy she sent to war isn't the man coming home? After a few years of service, John retired from the military and returned to civilian life. But after retirement, his life disappeared from public view. No one remembered him. He had fought in Vietnam, but his story was lost in the broader narrative of a war the country wanted to forget. No one spoke of his final mission, of that legendary moment when he had done the impossible. No one remembered Sergeant John R. Mitchell. He had no voice in matters concerning the war he had fought. The medal sat in a drawer, the commendations gathered dust, and the man who had once been a legend became just another veteran struggling to find his place in a world that had moved on without him. But one day, decades after the war ended, a journalist named David Chun received a tip from an unexpected source. He had been researching a book about forgotten heroes of the Vietnam War when he received a call from Robert "Bobby" Wilson, now a retired construction worker living in Ohio. Bobby had served in John's squad and had carried the guilt of survival for 40 years. "There's a story that needs to be told," Bobby said, his voice thick with emotion. "About a man who saved more lives than anyone knows, but never said a word about it." Bobby told Chun about the final mission, about how John had discovered that the abandoned firebase wasn't just a staging area for an enemy offensive. It was a prisoner of war camp where 17 American soldiers were being held and tortured. The intelligence reports had missed this crucial detail. Command had ordered them to destroy the facility, not knowing that doing so would mean the death of their own countrymen. John had made a choice that day that went against direct orders, but aligned with something deeper, his humanity. He could have followed orders, Bobby explained to the journalist. Could have called in the airstrike and walked away. Would have been the safe play, the by-the-book play. But when he saw those Americans in those bamboo cages, saw what had been done to them, he made a different choice. He went in alone first, took out the guards, and got those prisoners to safety before completing the mission. 17 families got their sons, fathers, and husbands back because of what John did. But he made us all swear never to talk about it. Said it wasn't heroism, just doing what needed to be done. Chun was intrigued but needed more verification. He spent months tracking down other members of John's unit, piecing together the full story of that final mission. What he discovered was even more remarkable than Bobby's initial account. John hadn't just rescued 17 prisoners. He had single-handedly dismantled an entire enemy intelligence operation. The abandoned firebase had been a front for a sophisticated network that was feeding information about American troop movements to enemy commanders. By taking it out, John had prevented what could have been a catastrophic ambush that would have cost hundreds of American lives. The journalist decided to publish the story of this silent man. His article, titled "Silent Echoes of War: The Untold Story of Sergeant John R. Mitchell," was published in a national magazine and read across the country. Many people, for the first time, realized just how difficult and devastating the operations in Vietnam had truly been. John had not only saved the lives of his comrades and the prisoners in his final mission, but had also preserved the lives of countless others throughout the forest and beyond. This was not just the story of a single soldier, but the final tale of a living legend. The article detailed not just that one mission, but the pattern of quiet heroism that had defined John's entire tour of duty. There was the time he had carried a wounded enemy soldier to safety, earning the respect of local villagers who provided crucial intelligence about planned attacks. There was the night he had talked a fellow American soldier out of committing a war crime, preventing an incident that could have escalated the conflict. There were dozens of small acts of courage and compassion that had rippled outward, touching lives in ways that John himself might never have realized. John R. Mitchell became a hero recognized worldwide, but he remained unaware of this recognition for some time. When reporters finally tracked him down to the small ranch where he lived in quiet retirement, his response was characteristically humble. He told them he felt no pride in what others called heroism. He was just a soldier, a man who had done his duty. But finally, the public remembered him, and the truth of real heroism spread across the nation and beyond. The story resonated with people in ways that surprised everyone, including the journalist who had written it. Veterans who had never spoken about their service began to share their own stories. Families learned for the first time about the sacrifices their loved ones had made in distant jungles. A new understanding emerged about the complexity of war, about the impossible choices faced by young men far from home, about the cost of sending a generation to fight in a conflict that the country itself didn't fully understand. John's story became a symbol of something larger: the thousands of soldiers who had served without recognition, who had come home to indifference or hostility, who had carried their burdens in silence. The article sparked a national conversation about how America honors its veterans, about the difference between the politics of war and the humanity of the people who fight them. It reminded people that behind every uniform was a person with fears, hopes, and an unbreakable commitment to the brothers and sisters serving beside them. After his story was published, John R. Mitchell's family looked at him with new eyes. He was no longer just a soldier, but something much more, a reminder of the best impulses of human nature under the worst possible circumstances. But John, as always, simply said quietly, "I am a soldier, this was my duty," and concluded his story in the way he had lived his life, without fanfare, without seeking credit, without asking for anything in return. Sarah closed the journal and looked around the cemetery where her grandfather now rested. The headstone was simple, bearing only his name, rank, and dates of service. But now she understood that it marked the resting place of someone extraordinary, not because he had sought glory or recognition, but because he had consistently chosen to do what was right, even when no one was watching, even when it would have been easier to look away. The real heroism, she realized, had indeed been found in his silence, in his refusal to boast about his actions, in his commitment to carrying the weight of difficult decisions without burdening others, in his ability to come home and build a life of quiet service to his family and community. He had taught her to be strong not through his war stories, but through his daily example of integrity, compassion, and selfless love. As she walked away from the cemetery that day, Sarah carried with her not just the knowledge of her grandfather's extraordinary military service, but a deeper understanding of what it means to be a hero. Heroes, she now knew, are not defined by applause or recognition, but by the strength of their actions when no one else is looking, by their willingness to sacrifice for others, and by their commitment to values that transcend their own self-interest. The story of Sergeant John R. Mitchell became part of a larger narrative about America's forgotten warriors, the silent heroes who had served their country in its darkest hours and asked for nothing in return, except the chance to come home and live in peace. His tale inspired others to look more closely at the quiet heroes in their own lives, the teachers who stayed late to help struggling students, the neighbors who checked on elderly residents, the first responders who ran toward danger while others ran away. In the end, John's greatest victory was not any single battle he had fought in the jungles of Vietnam, but the life he had built afterward, raising a granddaughter who would grow up to become a teacher, touching the lives of hundreds of children, passing on the values of service and sacrifice that he had embodied without ever speaking of them directly. His legacy lived not in the medals tucked away in a drawer, but in the kindness, courage, and integrity that he had modeled every day of his civilian life. We honor those who silently carry the weight of history, the real heroes who never seek recognition but leave behind a legacy that never fades. Sergeant John R. Mitchell is just one of many silent warriors whose stories deserve to be told, whose sacrifices deserve to be remembered, and whose example continues to inspire us to be better than we thought possible.